The wine glass shattered against the marble a half-second before the laughter started. Helen Marchetti stood frozen at the edge of the Astor Grand ballroom, and 400 faces turned toward her like searchlights. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured gold across a sea of black silk and diamonds, and every one of those diamonds seemed pointed at the wine now soaking into the hem of her dress, the only formal dress she owned. The navy one she'd steamed twice in her cramped apartment because she'd been so afraid of a single wrinkle. A wrinkle, as if that had ever been. Oh, careful. A voice cut through the string quartet, smooth as poured cream and twice as cold. The whole table nearly went over. The laughter came then, not scattered. It rolled through the ballroom in a wave, and Helen understood with a sick lurch that it had been waiting, that these people had been watching her since she walked in. The woman in the wrong dress with the wrong body and the wrong hands. Hands nicked and burn-scarred from 20 years over a stove. The woman who had spoken stepped into the light. She was beautiful, the way a blade is beautiful, silver blonde hair swept back from a face that had cost a fortune to keep perfect, a champagne flute balanced in fingers heavy with rings, a gown the color of blood in candlelight. Everything about her said she had never once been told to take up less room. "You must be the chef," she said, and her eyes traveled down Helen's body slowly, an inventory taken in public. How charming. They'll invite anyone to these things now. Vivienne. A second woman touched her arm, giggling. "Be nice." "I'm always nice. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Vivienne Castellano lowered her voice to a stage whisper engineered to carry. "Someone should tell her this table is for refined people." Not a delicate pause, a flick of the wrist toward Helen's frame that... The ballroom laughed again, and Helen, who had spent 34 years learning to shrink, to fold her shoulders inward, to apologize for the space her body took up in a world that had decided that space was a crime, felt something in her chest crack straight down the middle. She could have run. Every nerve screamed at her to run. She'd cooked for the kings of her small corner of the city, fed cab drivers at 3 a.m., and grieving widows and 100 lonely men who ate alone at her counter, and none of them had ever looked at her like she was a mistake. But her feet wouldn't move, and her voice, when it came, surprised her. "I was invited," Helen said quietly, "same as you." Vivienne's smile didn't waver. "Were you, though? Or did someone feel sorry for you?" "Sweetheart, this is the Culinary Foundation's night. These are the people who matter. Go sit in the back, if they even have a chair that'll hold you." The gasp laugh that rippled out was the ugliest sound Helen had ever heard. Her eyes burned. She hated that they burned. She would not cry, not here, not in front of these women in their borrowed jewels, but her vision was going glassy, and the room was tilting. Enough. The word wasn't shouted. That was the thing Helen would remember for the rest of her life. It landed soft, almost gentle, from somewhere at the far end of the ballroom, and yet it dropped over 400 people like a physical weight, and the laughter died in a single held breath. The string quartet stopped mid-note. At the head table, beneath the largest chandelier, a man was rising to his feet. Helen had noticed him earlier without letting herself look the way you notice. A fire from across a field, aware of the heat before you understand the danger. Tall, broad through the shoulders in a way his perfectly cut tuxedo did nothing to disguise. Dark hair shot with the faintest silver at the temples, a face carved for a Roman coin, all hard, clean lines and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his stillness that undid the room. Everyone else moved constantly gesturing, laughing, performing wealth. This man was utterly, unnervingly still. He set down his glass. The small click of crystal on linen was the only sound in the entire hall. "Alessandro Ferri," someone breathed behind Helen, and she felt the temperature of the room change. She didn't know the name. Everyone else clearly did, and whatever they knew had turned their faces the color of ash. He came around the head table slowly, unhurried. With every step, the crowd peeled back from him, an invisible current parting the sea of silk. Vivienne Castellano's smile had frozen into something brittle. He stopped in front of Helen. Up close, he was overwhelming. She had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes, and when she did, she found them dark and depthless and fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch, not pity. This was something else, something that looked almost like recognition. as if he was seeing someone he'd been searching a long time to find. "Miss Marchetti," he said, low and roughened, "I apologize. You should never have been spoken to that way in a room where my name is on the invitation." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. He turned to the Foundation official hovering behind him, pale and sweating. "Clear the hall." The man blinked. I'm sorry. The gala is over. Everyone leaves. Now." For a moment, nobody moved. 400 of New York's wealthiest, most powerful people simply stood there, certain they'd misheard. Then Vivienne laughed high, disbelieving. "You can't be serious. Alessandro, these are the most important people in the..." He looked at her. He simply looked, and whatever Vivienne Castellano saw in that look drained the blood from her face and killed the words in her throat. Helen watched a woman who had commanded the entire ballroom take an involuntary step backward. "Mrs. Castellano," Alessandro said, and now there was frost in it, a cold so complete it made the marble seem warm. "You will collect your friends, and you will leave my event, and you will consider, very carefully on the drive home, whose guest she is." A pause that lasted an eternity. "Give my regards to Marco." The name landed like a slap. Vivienne's composure shattered visibly. "Everyone," Alessandro said, turning back to the room, "out." And the impossible happened. They went. Slowly at first, then faster. A flood of stunned millionaires gathering their wraps and their pride, and streaming toward the exits, not one daring to protest. The society women who'd laughed loudest fled fastest. Vivienne swept out in their center, her blood-red gown the last thing to vanish through the gold doors. Within minutes, the great ballroom stood empty, chandeliers blazing over abandoned tables, half-drunk champagne going warm, 400 chairs, and only 2 people left standing among them. Helen stared at the man who had just emptied a room for her, and found she was shaking. "Why?" she managed. "Would you do that?" Alessandro didn't answer right away. He walked past her to the head table, the grandest in the room, directly beneath the largest chandelier, and pulled out a chair. The gesture was so simple, so absurdly gentle after the storm he'd just conjured, that it stole the breath from her lungs. "Because you were invited to sit here," he said quietly. "Not in the back. Here, at the best table in the room, please." She should have run. Instead, on legs that barely held her, Helen crossed the marble and sat down at the head table, and Alessandro Ferri pushed in her chair. He sat across from her, and for a long moment neither spoke. The empty ballroom hummed, chandeliers singing their faint crystal note. "You're the sponsor," Helen said finally. "The whole gala, aren't you?" "I fund the foundation. Yes. Among other things." He turned a wine glass by its stem, not drinking. "Then you just torched your own event." It was already worthless. The moment they laughed. She looked down at her ruined dress, at the wine stain spreading like a bruise, and the humiliation of the last 10 minutes rose again, but underneath it now was confusion, so total it made her dizzy. "I don't know you. I've never met you. Why would you empty a ballroom for a stranger you've never..." She stopped, because he was looking at her with that expression again, the recognition, and something cold and electric moved down her spine. "Have we?" she whispered. "Met?" Alessandro set down the glass. "Table 9, he said. "By the window. You always tried to give me the booth, but I liked the counter. Black coffee, no sugar." And on the bad nights his voice roughened, and for the first time a crack showed in that perfect marble control, the short rib, the one that wasn't on the menu. "You made it for me the first night I came in looking like a man who'd forgotten how to eat." The floor dropped out from under Helen's world. She knew him. Not Alessandro Ferri, the name that had emptied a ballroom, but the man in the good coat who'd started coming to Rossi's diner a little over a year ago. Always late, always alone, always at the counter. She'd never known his name. He'd never offered it. But she'd known his face, the exhaustion under his eyes, the particular loneliness of a man who ate at midnight because he had no one to eat with. She'd fed him for 14 months. She'd worried about him on the nights he didn't come. "That was you," she breathed. "You're the man from the counter." "I'm the man from the counter." Something in him eased at hearing her say it. "You were kind to me, Helen. When I had nothing to offer you but a bad mood and a big appetite, you were kind anyway. To someone in my position, kindness with nothing behind it is the rarest thing in the world." Understanding arrived in pieces. each landing harder. The award. The nomination was anonymous. I thought it must be a mistake. Someone confused me with a real... You are a real chef. Stealing it now. The best I've ever eaten, and I've eaten in every city in the world. I nominated you, anonymously, because I knew if my name were attached, you'd never believe you earned it, and you did. Every bit of it. Tears came again, hot and stunned and disbelieving, and she pressed the back of her scarred hand against her mouth. You did all this, she whispered, just because I made you short ribs. No, his voice dropped to something so low and raw it barely crossed the table. I did all this because for 14 months, that diner counter was the only place in my life I felt like a human being instead of a weapon, because you looked at me like I was a person. Because in a world where everyone wants something from me, my money, my protection, my fear, you never wanted anything but for me to eat and to be all right. He looked away, as if the honesty cost him. I'm not a man who has words for things, but I have other ways. And tonight one of those ways was making sure not a single person who laughed at you will sleep easy again. The intensity should have frightened her. Instead, sitting across from him in that vast empty room, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt seen. The rain started as they left. He walked her out through a service exit, into an alley where a black SUV waited with its engine running, a man in a dark suit holding the door without being asked. Only then did Helen begin to understand the shape of what she'd walked into. There was a second SUV behind the first, a third at the mouth of the alley. The men standing in the rain weren't standing casually. They were standing the way soldiers stand, eyes moving, hands near their coats. Who are you? She asked. Rain caught the streetlight and turned to gold falling around them. Really? Alessandro paused with his hand on the door. You saw the most powerful people in New York run for the doors because I asked them to. You've already guessed, Helen. You're too smart not to have. He met her eyes through the rain. The question you're really asking is whether it changes how you see me, and I find I very much need it not to, which is a weakness I have not permitted myself in 20 years. You told Vivian to give your regards to Marco. Who's Marco? Something shuddered behind his eyes. Marco Castellano, Vivian's husband, the head of one of 3 families who have spent the last decade wishing me dead. The bottom of her stomach dropped. Those women. At the gala. The ones who... Vivian Castellano, Sophia Bruno, Angela Rizzo, the wives of the 3 men who most want to destroy me. Tonight, in front of 400 witnesses, they chose to humiliate a woman under my protection. They thought you were nobody. A diner cook who wandered into the wrong room. His eyes met hers, and there was something almost like grief in them. By clearing that hall, I told every family in this city otherwise. I made you visible, Helen, and I'm sorry. Invisibility is the safest thing a person can own in my world. Tonight, I took yours. Helen stood in the rain and understood that the most protective thing this man had ever done had also just painted a target on her back. Then why do it, she said. Because some prices I would rather pay than watch you pay. And he opened the car door. The weeks that followed rewrote Helen's entire life. Perhaps it began the second night, when she came home to find the broken lock on her apartment door replaced with something that belonged on a bank vault, a note in a hard, slanted hand. You shouldn't have been living behind a lock like the old one, eh? Perhaps it was when the diner's landlord, who'd threatened to sell the building out from under old Mr. Rossi for months, suddenly withdrew his notice, apologized, and disappeared to Florida. Perhaps it was the way Alessandro came back to the counter. He came late, the way he always had. Black coffee, no sugar. He never brought his men inside. They waited in the SUVs at the curb, and Helen learned to bring them coffee too, in paper cups, because they looked cold and she couldn't help herself. The first time she did it, Alessandro watched her through the window with an expression she pretended not to see. And she began, without quite meaning to cook for him, really cook, the way she never let herself for the harried 9-to-5 crowd. It became a private thing between them, played out over a laminate counter at midnight. She'd watch him come through the door carrying whatever weight he carried, and she'd read it in his shoulders, and she'd decide what he needed before he sat down. The nights he came in cold and hollow, she made him cacio e pepe the way her grandmother had, standing over the pan, folding the pasta into the emulsion by feel, no measuring, cracking pepper until the steam went sharp with it. "You cook like you're having an argument with the food," he told her once, watching her wrist snap the pan. "I'm winning," she said, and slid the bowl across, and watched his eyes close on the first bite in a way that felt more intimate than a kiss. The nights he came in wired, jaw tight, some invisible violence humming under his skin, she made him something slow, a brodo she'd started at dawn, or braised short rib gone soft enough to eat with a spoon, because a body that tense needs something that asks nothing of it. She learned his palate the way she'd once learned knife work, patiently, obsessively, until she could set a plate in front of him and watch the day drain out of his face. "You feed people like it's a language," he said one night, near closing, the diner dim around them. "It is a language." She wiped the counter in slow circles. "It's the only one I ever trusted. People lie with words all the time. Nobody lies about being hungry. You put something good in front of a person. Watch how they eat it. That's the truest thing you'll ever know about them." She glanced up. "You eat like a man who's not sure he's allowed to." "Did you know that?" For a moment he didn't answer. Then, quietly, "You're the only person alive who has ever told me no, or told me anything true." The tension between them became a living thing. It lived in the space between the counter and his stool. It lived in the moments he reached to take a cup from her hand and their fingers nearly touched, and he pulled back, always pulled back, at the last second, as if some line existed he would not cross until she crossed it first. Once, closing up in the winter dark, she slipped on a wet tile, and he crossed the diner faster than she'd believed a man that size could move, and caught her one arm around her back, her hands flat against his chest, her face inches from his, and for 3 seconds neither breathed. Then he set her carefully on her feet, stepped away, and said in a voice gone to gravel, "You should be more careful." "I'm always careful." "No, you keep letting me sit at this counter." The war she'd been warned about arrived on a Tuesday. It came first as a black car that wasn't one of Alessandro's, idling across from the diner 3 nights running. Then as a man Helen didn't recognize sitting at the counter at closing, ordering nothing, watching her hands. Then, finally, as a phone call to the diner's landline at 11 p.m., a woman's voice, silk smooth and poisonous. "You must be so proud of yourself," Vivienne Castellano said, the little cook who caught Alessandro Ferri's eye. "Do you have any idea what you've become, sweetheart? What you're worth now to the people who want to hurt him?" A soft, terrible laugh. "He made you visible, and now everyone can see you, my husband especially." The line went dead. He was already coming through the door, she'd learn later. The diner's line was one of a dozen things his men quietly watched. He crossed the room and took her face in both his hands, the first time he had ever touched her like that, his dark eyes searching hers for damage. "Did they touch you?" he said. Not a question, a demand of the universe. "Helen." It was a phone call. Just a phone call. But she was gripping his wrists and couldn't stop. She said, "Marco." I know what she said. His thumbs moved over her cheekbones, and his voice had gone to a place so cold and quiet it frightened her more than shouting. "From tonight, you don't close alone. You don't walk anywhere alone. 2 of my men, every hour you're not with me. I need you to let them. Can you do that? For me? You're scaring me." "Good." His forehead dropped to hers. "Be scared. Scared people live." He closed his eyes. "Everything I've ever let anyone see me love has been used against me. And then you and your damned short ribs and your paper cups of coffee, you made me forget to hide it. This is my fault, and I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let it cost you anything." She should have pulled away. She pulled him closer. "Then don't hide it," Helen whispered. "Not from me. I've known what you are since the rain. I fed you for 14 months when you were just a lonely man at my counter, and you were good to me. So stop pulling your hand back, every time. I've noticed. Stop it." For one heartbeat, Alessandro Ferri went completely still. And then, at last, he stopped pulling away. He kissed her, like a man dying of thirst who had decided to stop pretending the well wasn't there, and Helen understood exactly how much control it had cost him for 14 months to sit at her counter and want and never reach. But even that, even the way his arms closed around her like he could keep the whole world off her, wasn't what broke her open. It was that when he pulled back, breathing hard, he pressed his lips to her forehead and said the thing she'd never expected to hear in a life spent being told she was too much. There has never been too much of you. Do you understand me? Every person in that ballroom who looked at you and saw excess, they were starving, Helen, and looking at a feast, and hating you for it. You are not too much. You have never been too much. You are exactly, precisely enough. She cried then, really cried, and he held her through it in the empty diner with the rain starting again against the windows. The strike came 10 days later, through the one thing she loved that couldn't be locked or guarded. Marco Castellano's men firebombed Rossi's diner at 4 a.m. when they believed it empty. It was not empty. Old Mr. Rossi, 78 and unable to sleep, had come in early to start the bread, as he'd done for 40 years. Helen got the call from the hospital at 4:40 and was there in 20 minutes. Alessandro was there in 15, and she found him in the corridor with blood on his hands, Mr. Rossi's blood, from pulling the old man out of the smoke himself before the fire crews arrived, because he'd had a man watching, and that man had called him first. Helen stopped dead and looked at Alessandro Ferri standing in his ruined shirt, soot-streaked, the old man's blood drying on his forearms, and something in her chest that had been holding out finally surrendered. "He's alive," he said before she could ask. "Smoke and a broken arm from a beam. He'll live. I got him out." His voice shook with a rage gone quiet. "I got him out, Helen." She crossed the corridor and put her arms around him, blood and soot and all, and felt the exact moment the most feared man in New York stopped holding himself up and let her hold him instead. "This was for me," she whispered. "They did this to hurt you through me." "Yes. What are you going to do?" Alessandro pulled back, and the tenderness was still there, but under it now was something that made her understand fully, for the first time, what he was. "I'm going to end it," he said. "All of it. I've been patient for 10 years because patience kept the people around me alive. I'm done being patient." He put an old man in a hospital bed to send me a message. A terrible calm. "I'm going to answer it." He moved her to a safe house on the coast, a spare, beautiful place of glass and stone above a stormy Atlantic, and Helen learned what it meant to love a man while he did the things he did. The first 2 days nearly broke her. Not the isolation, though the isolation was total. 2 guards. No phone but the one he'd given her. The grey sea hammering the rocks below like it wanted in. What broke her was the waiting. Knowing that somewhere across the water, the man who cupped her face like it was made of glass was doing something she couldn't picture and didn't want to. She'd stand at the window watching the storm and try to hold 2 men in her mind at once, the one at her counter and the one out there in the dark, and find she couldn't make them into a single person, and hate herself a little for not being sure she wanted to. She didn't sleep. She paced the beautiful empty rooms and argued with herself. "You knew what he was. You said it. Since the rain, you said. You don't get to love the gentle one and pretend the other one isn't real." And under that, quieter, uglier, an old man is in a hospital bed because of you, because you couldn't just leave a ballroom, because for once you wanted to take up space. By the 3rd night, she couldn't stand the churn of it anymore, so she did the only thing she had ever known how to do with a feeling too big to hold. She went into the kitchen, and she cooked. It was a good kitchen, absurdly good, the kind of kitchen a man buys and never uses. She found the makings of something in the pantry and the cold room, and she stopped thinking and let her hands take over. She made ragu the slow way, the only way that counted, the way that can't be rushed and doesn't forgive shortcuts. She browned the meat in batches so the pan never crowded. She let the sofrito go soft and sweet and patient, onion and carrot and celery melting down until the smell of it filled the whole glass house and pushed the smell of the sea back out to where it belonged. She deglazed with red wine and watched it cook down to almost nothing. She crushed the tomatoes by hand because that was how her grandmother did it, and her grandmother had been right about everything. And she let it simmer. Hours. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the warm oven and listened to the pot tick and breathe. And somewhere in those hours, the 2 men in her mind stopped being 2 men. Because this was how she loved. Not with words. With hours over a low flame. With the patient transformation of hard things into something that could feed a person. And if she could do that with a tough cut of meat, then maybe she could do it with the truth of him too. Take the hard, unforgiving fact of what he was and hold it long and low and steady until it became something she could live beside. He came back at 3 in the morning of the 4th night. She heard the car. The low voices, the door. She was still up. She'd known, somehow, that he'd come. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and just looked at her, at the woman standing at his stove in his too-big house at 3 a.m., stirring a pot that had been going for 6 hours. And she watched the exhaustion in his face war with something that looked like it hurt worse than exhaustion. "You should be asleep," he said. "You should be hungry." She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't ask what he'd done. She lifted a spoon from the ragu and held it out across the kitchen. "Come here. Taste this. Tell me if it needs salt." He crossed the room like a man walking toward the only warm thing in a cold country. He tasted it. He closed his eyes. And Helen watched the whole terrible night drain out of his face, the way it always did, the way it had at her counter 100 times, watched him become, for a moment, just a tired man being fed by someone who wanted nothing from him but to see him eat. "It doesn't need salt," he said roughly. "No, it doesn't." She took his hands, his clean hands, she noticed. He'd washed, wherever he'd been, before he came to her, and she understood the mercy in that and let it be a mercy. "Sit down. I'll make you a plate." He sat. He watched her move through his kitchen, and when she set the bowl in front of him, he caught her wrist gently, the scarred one, and pressed it to his mouth, and said against her skin, "I don't deserve to be fed by you. Not tonight. Not with what these hands did tonight. I know what your hands did tonight." She didn't pull away, and I know what they did at the hospital. "Same hands. I'm choosing to feed both." She freed her wrist and pushed the fork toward him. "Eat, Alessandro. That's all I've ever asked of you. It's all I'm asking now. Eat, and let me sit with you while you do it. And in the morning we'll figure out how I live in your world. Because I'm going to. I've decided. But tonight, you're just going to eat what I made you." He ate. She sat across the small table with the sea roaring below, and neither of them said anything else, and it was the most honest hour of her life. She never learned all of what happened in the days that followed. She understood that was a mercy, and she let it be one. But she learned one thing, because he chose to let her see it, and she thought, later, that he let her see it on purpose, because he was done hiding, and because a woman who has decided to live in a man's world deserves to see it once, with her own eyes. On the last night, he took her with him. Not into the dark, never into the dark, but to the edge of it. A private club downtown, closed for the evening, black cars along the curb. He sat her in a quiet back room with a glass of wine and one of his men at the door, and he said, "There's a conversation I have to have. I'd rather you didn't hear it. But I'd rather you never wonder what I am than protect you from knowing." He kissed her forehead. "The door will be open a crack. Listen if you need to, then decide." She listened. Marco Castellano came in loud, the way men come in when they're afraid and can't afford to show it. Helen heard the scrape of a chair. Heard Vivienne's voice too, brittle and high, the champagne cream gone thin. "You empty a room for a cook," Marco said. "You firebomb you turn my own people against me over a fat little short-order cook. Careful." Just the one word, in that voice, and the room went quiet the way the ballroom had gone quiet. Helen heard Alessandro sit, heard the unhurried patience of him, the terrible calm she'd only ever felt turned toward her as tenderness, turned now the other way. "You sent men to a diner in the dark," Alessandro said. "You thought it was empty. It wasn't. There was an old man inside, 78. No family. 40 years behind that counter, and your men put him in the smoke and drove away. That's who you are, Marco. Not a boss, not a soldier. A man who burns down a diner in the dark and calls it a message. A pause. Here's mine. I've spent 10 years keeping this city from a war because war costs more than either of us can pay. I was willing to keep paying that price, and then your wife opened her mouth at a party, and you decided a woman who fed me when I had nothing was a weakness you could pull on." His voice dropped. "You were wrong. She's not the weakness. She's the one thing I stopped being willing to be patient about." Alessandro Vivienne's voice, cracking now, all the cruelty gone out of it, and only fear left. "Please, we didn't at the gala. It was just words. It was just words. Something almost gentle in it, which was the most frightening thing Helen had ever heard. You stood in a room full of people and taught them it was safe to laugh at her. Do you know what that costs a person, Vivienne? Being taught they take up too much space. Do you know how long it takes to unlearn? A silence. No, you don't. You've never once in your life been made small. So let me teach you the way you taught her." Helen never heard a threat. That was the thing she carried away. He never raised his voice, never named a consequence. He simply told them, quietly, everything he knew, the accounts, the names, the things the Castellanos had spent a decade believing were hidden, and let the silence do the rest. By the time it was over, Marco Castellano was a man whose whole world had just been shown to him, held in another man's open hand, waiting to be closed. "You'll leave the city," Alessandro said finally. "Both of you. Tonight. And you'll spend the rest of your lives being nobody in a place where nobody knows your name. You'll find out what she found out. And maybe, in 20 years, you'll understand what it was you laughed at. A chair scraped. Get out of my sight." They got out. When he came into the back room, Helen was standing, the wine untouched. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in his face, real fear. The fear of a man who has just let the woman he loves watch him be what he is. "Now you've seen it," he said quietly. "The other one, the one I'm not, at your counter. Tell me you can," he stopped. "Tell me." Helen crossed the room and took his terrible, careful hands in her scarred ones. "Same hands," she said. "I told you. I've been choosing both since the hospital." She lifted them to her mouth, the way he'd done to hers. "You didn't hurt them, Alessandro. I heard the whole thing. You had every reason and every means, and you sent them away with their lives. You held the fire. For me." Her eyes filled. "That's the man I fell in love with at a laminate counter. He held the fire. Take me home." He made a sound she'd never heard him make, and pulled her against his chest, and held on. It was not a quick thing after that, and she was glad of it. She had told him, in the glass house at 3 a.m, that in the daylight they would figure out how she was going to live in his world. And they did slowly, in the weeks that followed, the hard adult work of it. There were conversations that weren't romantic at all, about the men who would always be at the edge of her life now, about the route she'd take and the ones she wouldn't, about what it meant, permanently, to be the thing a powerful man loved that she would always be. To some degree, a door someone might try to open to get to him, and that no lock in the world made that fully untrue. Some nights, she raged about it. She was 34 years old, and she had spent every one of those years learning to be smaller, and she was done, and it was a bitter thing to finally decide to take up space and discover the space came with guards. She said as much, more than once, and he let her say it. He never once told her she was overreacting. That, she thought, was its own kind of love, that a man who could empty ballrooms would sit at a kitchen table and let her be furious at the shape of the life he'd given her, and not defend himself because she was right. "I can undo it," he told her one night, and meant it. "Not the past, but the future. I can put you back in a small, quiet life and step out of it. You'd be safe, invisible again. I've told you I'll erase myself if that's the true thing you want. It would be the kindest thing I've ever done, and the hardest." Helen thought about it. She let herself really think about it, because he deserved a real answer, and not a romantic one. "Invisible was never safe," she said finally. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. Invisible was 34 years of folding myself up so nobody would point. Invisible was a table set for one." She reached across and took his hand. "I don't want small and quiet if small and quiet means without you. I'll take the guards. I'll take the roots and the rules and being a door somebody might try to open. I'll take all of it. Because the alternative is a life where I made myself small again. And I'm done being small, Alessandro. I decided that in a ballroom before I knew who you were." She smiled, wet-eyed. "You just gave me a reason to keep deciding it." They rebuilt Rossi's first. That mattered to her more than anything, and he understood without being told. "Mister." Rossi got his diner back better than it was, though the old man grumbled that the new counter didn't have the burns in it that told him where 40 years had gone, so Helen took a hot pan to it herself one afternoon, in the exact spot, and the old man cried and pretended he hadn't. She kept cooking there. She would not give it up, and Alessandro would not have asked her to. He'd fallen in love with a woman at a counter, and he was not fool enough to take the counter away. But now, on the good nights, she cooked at a table too, a real table, in a real home above the city, where a man who had eaten alone for so long learned what it was to come home to the smell of something on the stove, and someone glad to hear the door. They were married in the spring, in a small stone church on the coast with the Atlantic thundering below and old Mr. Rossi arm out of its cast, grinning like a boy giving her away. There were no 400 guests. There were no society wives in blood-red gowns. There were fewer than 30 people, most of them men in dark suits who had spent years being frightening and who wept openly when their boss, the man who had never let any of them see him unguarded, turned to watch Helen walk down the aisle and forgot, entirely, to keep his face like marble. She wore ivory, and she did not steam it twice out of fear, and she did not fold her shoulders in or apologize for a single inch of the space she took up, because the man at the altar was looking at her the way he'd looked at her across that empty ballroom a year before, like recognition, like the end of a long search, like a starving man finally allowed to sit down at the feast. The reception was held, at Helen's insistence, in the rebuilt diner, red vinyl booths and all. She cooked it herself. Of course she cooked it herself. She'd have fought anyone who tried to stop her, and the dangerous men ate her food off diner plates and argued about whose nonna made better ragu, and lost. All of them, to hers. Alessandro stood to make a toast, and the whole room went silent the way rooms always did when he stood. "A year ago," he said, "in a ballroom full of people who mattered, someone told my wife she was too much to sit at their table." He looked at Helen, and the crack in the marble was permanent now, and he didn't try to hide it. They were wrong about many things that night, but they were most wrong about that. There was never too much of her. There was only ever a world too small to deserve her. He raised his glass, and his voice dropped to something meant only for her, though the whole room heard it and no one breathed. "So I built a bigger one. Sit at my table, Helen, the best seat in the room, for the rest of my life." She rose and crossed to him, and this time when he reached for her hand, he did not pull back. He never pulled back again. Late that night, when the guests had gone and the diner was theirs alone, Helen found him sitting at the counter, the old spot, table 9 by the window, the seat where a lonely stranger had once eaten short ribs that weren't on the menu. She came around and stood between his knees, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stayed like that a long time in the dark and quiet. "You know," she said finally, "you could sit at the table now. It's yours. Best seat in the room. You keep saying so." "I know." He pressed his face into her, breathing her in. "But this is where you found me, when I was nobody, when I had nothing to offer but a bad mood and an empty seat." His arms tightened. A man should remember where someone chose to feed him, before they knew what he was, when there was no reason to but kindness. Helen looked down at the most feared man in New York, holding on to her at a laminate counter like it was the only solid thing in the world, and she understood at last the whole shape of what she'd been given, that she had spent her life believing she was too much for every table she was seated at, and had ended up the one thing a man with the whole world at his feet could not, would not, ever have too much of. She kissed the top of his head. Outside, the rain began again, gold under the streetlights. "Then stay at the counter," she said. "I'll cook. You eat. Same as always." And he did. The rain fell gold on the window again, just as it had the night everything began, and in the quiet of that little diner, a woman who once believed she took up too much room finally sat exactly where she belonged. Somewhere along the way, Helen learned the truth we all spend our lives waiting to hear, that the right person doesn't ask you to be less, they simply pull out a chair. If Helen's story loosened something in your chest tonight, leave a like so it can find its way to someone who still believes they have to shrink to be loved. Subscribe to stay for the next story, and share this one with the person who has always been enough. Now tell me, when the world called her too much, where in your own life have you been made to feel the very same way?